I sat by the window, gazing at the hydrangeas blooming in the garden, reflecting on the changes in my life over the past few years. I'm Margaret Johnson, 62 years old. 2 years ago, I lost my beloved husband John, and since then, I've been living alone in this big house. After retiring from the local elementary school where I worked for 40 years, I was supposed to lead a quiet life. However, life took an unexpected turn. "Mom, can you watch Emily again today?" David's voice called from downstairs. I stood up with a deep sigh. "Of course, David. I'll be right there." As I descended the stairs, I saw my son David and his wife Karen hurriedly preparing for work as usual. And there was my 3-month-old granddaughter Emily, starting to fuss in her crib. "Thanks, Mom," David said gratefully, but his eyes were already glued to his smartphone screen. Karen was busy with her makeup, not even bothering to look our way. I picked up Emily and gently kissed her little head. "Good morning, my angel. Let's have another lovely day together." David works as an accountant, and Karen as a real estate agent, both leading busy lives. Since Emily was born, I could feel their demeanor deteriorating more and more, with the added burden of childcare on top of work stress. "Mom, we'll be late again tonight. Can you put Emily to bed?" Karen said while fixing her hair in the mirror. "Yes, of course," I answered, but inside, I felt a mix of emotions. While I'm happy to take care of my granddaughter, I can't shake the feeling that my own time is being taken away. After David and Karen left for work, I carried Emily to the kitchen. "Come on, let's make breakfast together, sweetie." As I prepared breakfast while talking to Emily, I suddenly remembered the Saturday farmers market. Every Saturday, I looked forward to taking Emily there. Not only did I buy fresh vegetables and fruits, but the interactions with people there soothed my heart. I especially enjoyed conversations with Sarah, a 21-year-old college student. She studies agriculture at the local university and enthusiastically talks about organic vegetables. Just last week, she taught me how to grow organic spinach. "You know, Emily, we'll see Sarah again on Saturday. She's really looking forward to seeing how you've grown." Emily moved her tiny hands as if she understood my words. I couldn't help but smile at her gesture. "That's right, I promised Sarah we'd meet again next week. I'm sure she's looking forward to it." Looking out the window while holding Emily, I saw Mrs. Wilson, our neighbor, tending to her garden. She's also an elderly woman living alone. I enjoyed having tea with her occasionally and talking about our grandchildren. However, recently, with the increasing friction with David and Karen, it had become difficult to have such peaceful moments. They seemed to think it was natural for me to take care of Emily, rarely considering my own time or feelings. "Oh, John. How I wish you were here," I whispered, gazing at a photo of my late husband. Emily made a small cooing sound. I came back to myself and gently hugged the baby. "I'm sorry, Emily. Grandma was feeling a bit lonely again." At that moment, I couldn't have imagined that I wouldn't be able to keep my promise to meet Sarah next Saturday. And that the reason for this would greatly change my life. That evening, when David and Karen returned home, I sensed a different atmosphere. They gathered in the kitchen, looking excited. Mom, we have amazing news, David exclaimed happily. I turned towards them, still holding Emily. What happened? Karen answered, we're planning a trip to Hawaii. I widened my eyes in surprise. Oh, that's wonderful. But what about Emily? David said with a smile, that's where we need your help, Mom. Could you take care of Emily for about 2 weeks? I hesitated. 2 weeks. That's too long. I can't do it alone. Karen interjected, but you can do it, Mom. You know Emily better than anyone. Those words made me feel conflicted. True, I know Emily better than anyone. But taking care of her alone for 2 weeks would be physically and mentally challenging. The next day, David and Karen went shopping at Costco. I stayed home with Emily, recalling their conversation. A few hours later, they returned with large shopping bags. Mom, look. We bought sunscreen and beach sandals for the trip, Karen showed me excitedly. I smiled wryly and replied, that's nice. But have you decided about Emily? David looked a bit troubled and said, actually, we checked with the local YMCA and childcare centers, but they're all full. We couldn't find a babysitter either. I sighed deeply. That's why I said I couldn't do it alone. That night, while I was putting Emily to sleep, David and Karen were whispering about something. I was curious about their behavior, but I couldn't leave Emily's side until she fell asleep. The next morning, their attitude had clearly changed. They looked as if they had made a firm decision. Mom, we need to talk, David said with a serious face. I answered, feeling uneasy, what is it? Karen began, we've thought of a good solution. At that moment, David suddenly grabbed my arm. I'm sorry, Mom. But this is the best way. Before I could say anything, they took me and Emily to the basement. Then, they uttered unbelievable words. The noisy brat and old hag can stay here. I heard the door close and the sound of a key turning. I was too shocked to speak. David. Karen. What are you doing? This isn't funny. I shouted desperately. But there was no response. Instead, I only heard the sound of footsteps going up the stairs. Emily, startled by the sudden events, began to cry. I tried to comfort her with shaking hands. Shoo, it's okay. Grandma's here with you. But my own voice was trembling. In the darkness of the basement, we were enveloped in fear of what would happen to us. Various thoughts raced through my mind. Why did they do this? Are they really going to Hawaii? Leaving us here? As Emily's cries echoed through the basement, I desperately tried to think. How to get out of here, how to call for help, how to protect Emily. Then, I suddenly remembered Sarah. The promise to meet her on Saturday. Maybe she would notice that we were missing. Clinging to that small hope, I held Emily tightly in the darkness. We had to face this long ordeal together. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness of the basement, I tried to assess our surroundings. Emily was still crying in my arms, but her voice had calmed a little. It's okay, Emily. Grandma's here with you, I said as I stood up and began to feel my way along the wall. Suddenly, I felt something under my foot. I bent down to touch it and found it was a plastic bag. A Walmart shopping bag. Inside were canned goods and bottled water. Ah, that's a relief, I sighed. At least David and Karen hadn't completely abandoned us. But anxiety soon hit me. How long could we survive on this food and water? Was there enough formula for Emily? I carefully checked the contents of the bag. Canned soup, vegetables, fruits. Several bottles of water. And Emily's formula and diapers. We'll have to use these carefully, I muttered. Next, I had to think about caring for Emily. Changing diapers, feeding her, and comforting her. How to do all this in a dark basement. Fortunately, my smartphone was in my pocket. Checking the battery, it was at 80%. I'll have to use this wisely, I thought as I used the flashlight function to change Emily's diaper. There, that should be good for a while, I said to Emily as I gently picked her up. Next, I had to think about how to escape. I began to thoroughly explore the basement. The door was sturdy and didn't seem easy to open. There was a small window, but it was at ground level and not big enough for an adult to fit through. I found an old toolbox and checked its contents. It contained a hammer, screwdriver, pliers, and other tools. I wonder if I can use these to open the door, I thought as I approached the door. However, no matter how many times I tried, the door wouldn't budge. Help! Can anyone hear me? I shouted, but there was no response. Exhausted, I sat on the floor, holding Emily. That's when I noticed an old radio. If only this would work. I thought as I picked up the radio. The batteries seemed to be dead, but I found spare batteries in the toolbox. After some struggle, I finally heard sound coming from the radio. I felt a glimmer of hope, having established a connection with the outside world. While listening to the news and music from the radio, I formulated my next plan. Hoping that Sarah would notice our absence, I also thought about what we could do ourselves. That's when I noticed the remnants of vegetables in the corner of the basement. Some of the vegetables I had bought at the farmer's market were starting to rot. That's it. I had an idea, remembering my knowledge about composting. If I could create a bad smell using the rotten vegetables, it might attract the attention of the neighbors. I carefully gathered the rotten vegetables and placed them near the small window. This might change our situation a bit, I thought, holding on to a small hope. As the days passed, I kept busy between caring for Emily and planning our escape. To calm Emily's cries, I remembered and started singing lullabies I used to sing long ago. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Grandma's gonna buy you a mockingbird. As I sang, I held Emily's tiny hand. Her presence gave me the strength to overcome this difficult situation. Managing the food and water was challenging. I minimized my own portions to ensure Emily had enough nutrition. I ate the canned goods little by little and rationed the water daily. Every day, I tried to pry open the door. I attempted to break the lock or remove the hinges using tools from the toolbox. But all attempts failed. I continued to call for help through the small window as loudly as I could. "Help! Can anyone hear us? We're in here." But there was no response. My voice seemed to be absorbed by the basement walls. The radio was our only comfort. Listening to the news helped us feel not completely isolated from the outside world. Sometimes, I would listen to music programs to soothe Emily. The bad smell strategy was more effective than I had expected. The odor of rotting vegetables seeped out through the small window. I prayed that someone would notice this unusual smell. As my sense of time became blurred, I spoke to Emily. "You know, Emily. Grandma will absolutely protect you. I'll find a way to get us out of here. And then we'll go to the farmer's market together again and meet Sarah." Emily looked at me as if she understood. At that moment, I renewed my determination. No matter what happens, I will protect this child. And I will definitely find a way to escape from here. In the darkness of the basement, our struggle had only just begun. Sarah was setting up for the farmer's market as usual. While arranging the organic vegetable stand run by her family, she suddenly felt something was off. "That's strange," she muttered. The familiar face of the kind old lady who visited every Saturday was nowhere to be seen. Margaret Johnson. She always came with her granddaughter, Emily. "I wonder if Margaret isn't coming today," Sarah thought, looking around. Sarah had become close to Margaret over the past few months. Margaret's warm smile and her joy in talking about Emily's growth had become a highlight of Sarah's Saturdays. She promised last week that we'd meet again this week. Worried, Sarah asked other regular customers. But no one had seen Margaret. "Maybe she's not feeling well," Sarah told herself, but she couldn't shake off an uneasy feeling. That evening, as Sarah was walking home, she passed by Margaret's house. Suddenly, she noticed a foul smell. Ugh! What a terrible odor! Holding her nose, she looked around. It wasn't garbage collection day. Yet, a strong stench was coming from Margaret's house. This is odd. Someone as meticulous as Margaret wouldn't let such a smell linger. Sarah stopped and stared at the house. The curtains were drawn, and she couldn't see inside. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Gathering her courage, she knocked on the front door. "Margaret? Emily? Is anyone home?" No answer. She knocked again, but still no response. Sarah's unease grew. Margaret's absence from the Saturday farmer's market, and now this strange situation. Could something bad have happened? She took out her smartphone and, hesitating slightly, dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice came through. Sarah hesitated but then began to speak. "I'm worried about an elderly neighbor. I haven't seen her for a few days. And now there's a strong, foul smell coming from her house. I understand. Can you give me more details?" Sarah explained about Margaret, her recent absence, and the strange smell coming from the house. "We'll send officers to check. Please wait there." After hanging up, Sarah felt relieved. Professional help was on the way. Reassuring herself, she waited for the police to arrive. 30 minutes later, a police car arrived without sirens. 2 officers got out of the car. "Good evening. Are you the one who called?" "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied. After getting more details from Sarah, the officers began to investigate around the house. They too noticed the foul smell and grimaced. "This definitely isn't normal," one officer said. They knocked on the door again and called out loudly. But still no response. "Let's ask the neighbors," the other officer suggested. The officers began to go around to the neighboring houses. Sarah watched, waiting anxiously. After a while, information from an elderly neighbor next door changed the situation dramatically. "Come to think of it, I saw David and his wife leaving with large bags late last Friday night. I haven't seen them since." The officers' expressions changed upon hearing this testimony. They returned to Margaret's house and tried to peek inside through the windows. "This," one officer muttered. "We might need to make an emergency entry." Sarah held her breath. As the situation rapidly unfolded, she felt a mix of fear that her worries might be justified and hope for Margaret and Emily's safety. The officers contacted their headquarters, requesting permission for an emergency entry. Sarah stood there, tense about what was about to happen. As the police officers were preparing for the emergency entry, a taxi approached from the distance. Sarah spotted familiar faces inside the car. "Isn't that David and Karen?" Sarah informed the police officers. The taxi stopped in front of the house, and David and Karen got out. Their expressions were bright, as if they had just returned from an enjoyable vacation, but they froze upon seeing the police vehicles. "What's going on here?" David shouted in surprise. Karen stood still, holding her luggage. "The police? Why?" A police officer approached them. "Are you David Johnson and Karen Johnson?" "Yes, we are," David answered. "Did something happen?" At that moment, the wind direction changed, and the strong stench from the basement reached their noses. "Ugh!" Karen held her nose. "What's this smell?" The color drained from David's face. "How did this happen?" "Don't tell me." The police officer said sternly, "We need to check on your mother and the baby's safety. Can you open the basement, please?" David and Karen were at a loss for words, looking at each other. Sarah felt something was off about their reaction. Under police supervision, David opened the basement door with trembling hands. As soon as the door opened, an even stronger stench wafted out. "Grandma! Emily!" Sarah cried out instinctively. The police officer carefully descended the stairs, shining a flashlight. When the scene in the basement was revealed, everyone gasped. In the dim corner of the basement, Margaret sat cradling Emily. They both looked weak, but seemed to be barely conscious. "Oh, thank goodness, they're alive," Sarah whispered, relieved. The police officer quickly approached Margaret and Emily to check their condition. "Call an ambulance," he instructed the other officer. David and Karen were speechless at the scene before them. "Mom! Emily!" David mumbled in a trembling voice. The police officer turned to face them. "David Johnson, Karen Johnson, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." Sarah watched this development with mixed feelings of surprise and anger. While relieved that Margaret and Emily were safe, she couldn't help but feel furious at David and Karen's actions. The paramedics arrived and began carefully rescuing Margaret and Emily. Sarah rushed to Margaret as she was being placed on a stretcher. "Margaret! Are you all right?" Margaret gave a weak smile. "Sarah, thank you." Emily also looked at Sarah and reached out her tiny hand. Seeing this scene, Sarah struggled to hold back her tears. "It's okay now, you're safe," she said. David and Karen were handcuffed and put into the police car. Neighbors, attracted by the commotion, had gathered around, and surprised voices could be heard from all directions. As the ambulance carrying Margaret and Emily headed to the hospital, Sarah was asked to accompany a police officer to the station for a statement. Although her mind was in turmoil from the events of the past few hours, one thing was clear: she was truly glad she had been able to help Margaret and Emily. 6 months had passed since that day, and on a calm afternoon, Margaret had just finished a counseling session at the local senior center. "How have you been lately, Margaret?" the counselor gently asked. Margaret smiled and answered, "I'm getting better, little by little. The time I spend with Emily is the best therapy." Recovering from the terrifying experience in the basement hadn't been easy, but regular counseling was helping her heal. "Have you thought about David and Karen?" the counselor carefully inquired. Margaret's expression clouded slightly. "Yes, they're on probation now. I hear they're doing community service on weekends." As a result of the trial, David and Karen were sentenced to 3 years of probation and 200 hours of community service. They had shown deep remorse and had sent Margaret several letters of apology. "I went to see them for the first time last week," Margaret continued. "They both seemed truly regretful. I'm torn between the anger inside me and the desire to forgive." The counselor gently placed a hand on hers. "Those are natural feelings. Let's work through them together, taking as much time as you need." "How did the custody hearing for Emily go?" the counselor asked. Margaret's face brightened. "The family court granted me custody. Emily is officially under my care now." The trial had been tough, but Margaret's devoted love and testimonies from community members, including Sarah, had influenced the judge's decision. "That's wonderful news. Congratulations," the counselor sincerely congratulated her. After the counseling session, Margaret headed to another room in the senior center. There, a support group for abuse victims was being held. "Hello, everyone," Margaret said as she entered the room, and the participants warmly welcomed her. This support group had become a significant support for Margaret. By sharing her experiences and listening to other victim stories, she could feel that she wasn't alone. After the meeting, Sarah was waiting outside. Margaret, how did it go? Margaret's face lit up at the sight of Sarah. Sarah, thank you for coming. The two went for a walk in a nearby park. Emily was sleeping in her stroller. Sarah, if it weren't for you, we might never have gotten out of that basement, Margaret expressed her gratitude. Sarah smiled shyly. I only did what anyone would do. I think protecting those we care about is something everyone can do. Margaret was deeply moved by her words. I'm truly grateful for your courage and kindness. Sitting on a park bench, they continued talking while watching Emily's sleeping face. I heard you met with David and Karen. Sarah asked quietly. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes. They both seemed to really regret what they did. They asked for my forgiveness. Sarah chose her words carefully. Whether to forgive them or not is up to you, Margaret. There's no need to force yourself. I know, Margaret took a deep breath. But holding on to hatred is tiring too. I want to find a path to reconciliation, little by little. Emily woke up and started to cry softly. Margaret gently picked her up, and the baby calmed down immediately. I want to create a better future for this child, Margaret said, softly stroking Emily's cheek. And for that, forgiveness might be necessary. Sarah was touched, her eyes welling up. Your strength never ceases to amaze me, Margaret. The two felt a deep bond that transcended generations. For Margaret, Sarah was like a daughter and a best friend. Come on, let's take Emily to the farmer's market, Margaret suggested. Fresh fruit is the best way to celebrate the beginning of a new life. Sarah nodded with a smile. That's a lovely idea. Let's go. The two of them, along with Emily, left the park in the gentle afternoon sunlight. The future of this small family, bound by new ties after overcoming hardship, was filled with hope.